Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Stephanie Bree, and today I'm asking the question, are comic book and superhero movies played out? Now, this is actually way more complicated than just yes or no, because there's so many factors at play that overlap, and a lot of people who analyze films sometimes miss some of the nuances. Now, I talk about my credentials a little bit on this topic. I actually did kind of go to film school. Now, I went to the University of Nebraska. We had an actual film school program at the Lincoln campus, but I actually went to a different campus that didn't have the actual film school program, but we had as close as you could get. So I took film history and theater classes and playwriting and all that kind of stuff. Now, ultimately, I would end up getting a degree in mass communications. My major was broadcasting, and my minor was theater, because that was as close as I could get to an actual film studies program. So I've watched a lot of films, and I studied them analytically. Now, I'm not an expert, but I just want to lay out my credentials so you know that, I'm not just talking out of my ass. So, the first thing I want to talk about is the numbers. So the first thing people say is, they make too many superhero movies. There's superhero fatigue. Audiences are getting bored. Now, I can counter that with a couple of illustrations that are going to prove that's not the case. Illustration number one, and again, there's nuance here, and I'm going to get into that. This is going to be a little longer video. Number one, the slasher film. Starting in 1978, we got a new batch, not just one or two, a new batch of slasher movies every year until about 1992. There was a lull in the early to mid-90s until Scream came along and revitalized the genre. But, was there audience fatigue? Did audiences get bored of slashers? Or did the slasher change? Well, let's talk output. You want to say there's too many superhero movies? Check this out. From 1978 to 1990, there were over 300 slashers developed. And we're talking about your standard slasher. Prom night, graduation day, Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street, Halloween, etc. 300 movies that undeniably fall under the slasher umbrella. And then a few that, have mixed genres, but slasher is among them, so they still count. From 1998 until today, 98 is when the comic book boom started with Blade, till today, there haven't even been 100 superhero movies, and that's comic book and superhero, and that's counting superheroes that are not based on comic books. That's counting Alita, Battle Angel, and stuff like that. I don't know all of them. You could even throw in stuff like even if you threw in stuff like Jumanji, because that's kind of an action adventure sort of superhero type flick. You could even throw in some other video game movies, and we don't even reach 200 films in those two genres combined. So we have at least a third to two-thirds fewer comic book and superhero movies, and around the same time span as we had over 300 slashers. And that's just slashers. That's not counting all horror movies. There are probably 1,000 or more horror movies released in that time span. Horror is a big genre. A lot of people dismiss it, but it is. Sci-fi, believe it or not, as far as output, is not as big a genre as horror. Meaning, you don't get per year, you don't get as many sci-fi movies released as you do horror movies. Especially when you count the sci-fi horror mixes, like Aliens and the Predators and Event Horizon and stuff. Those could go either way, but there's more of an emphasis usually on horror than sci-fi. But they still could go either way. Even when you take that into account, there's still more horror than sci-fi. But sci-fi movies in general make more money than horror movies in general. Not always, because there's always sci-fi B movies that bomb, but they're supposed to. They're B movies. You know, they're made for like a $50,000 budget. They make $1 or $2 million bucks. They're happy with that. You know, they're not supposed to be mega blockbusters. But your mega blockbusters, by the numbers, are more often science fiction or have sci-fi elements than not. You get outliers like Titanic and stuff like that. I can't think of any other examples. You know, I guess maybe Twister, but you could argue Twister is sci-fi, because at the time it was considered that, because of the technology they were using didn't exist. It wasn't real technology. But also it was written by prolific sci-fi author Michael Crichton. Rest in peace and show some damn respect. The dude knew what he was doing. He wrote some of the best science fiction ever written. You ever heard of a little known movie called Jurassic Park? Yeah, that's based on one of his books. Anyways, so yeah, in general, your biggest hits, your Star Wars, your Marvel Cinematic Universe, your Batmans, even Batmans are technically sci-fi. A lot of people debate this, but he's using technology that isn't real, and his villains are usually based on some type of chemical accident or some type of mutation or technology that, again, doesn't exist in the real world. So they're very much sci-fi. They're just not like hard sci-fi. There's nuances to the different degrees of sci-fi. You got Back to the Future. You've got the Alien franchise, the Terminator franchise, the Star Trek films. Those are all big mega blockbusters, right? They're all sci-fi. But they're not all comic book movies, and they're not all superhero movies. So then the real question becomes, is there sci-fi fatigue? And the answer to that is no. Because even amidst all of the horror sci-fi movies, the Terminators, the Predators, and stuff like that, and even in the midst of all the superhero and comic book movies, the MCU, the DCEU, etc., you had outliers like Alita Battle Angel, which I guess is sort of based on a comic book. You had the Maze Runners. You had the Hunger Games, which are based on a book, but not really a comic book. And you had others like the Divergent series and so on and so forth. Again, not really based on a comic book. They're not really comic book or even superhero movies. But they did well, And even amidst all of this, you got fantasy, right? You got a lot of comic book movies that you could argue are fantasy. Some people incorrectly label Star Wars sci-fi fantasy. It's not. It's science fiction. There's no fantasy in it. The Force is a matter of science in the Star Wars universe, not a manner of magic. So it's like Thor's magic. It's sci-fi, not fantasy. But you could make a case for it being sci-fi fantasy. But then you've got pure fantasy like the Lord of the Rings. Those are mega hits. The Harry Potters. Those are mega hits. And then you got some outliers. That blend genres like fantasy, sci-fi, horror, stuff like the Underworld, the Resident Evils, etc. But when you lock it down to just movies that are explicitly based on a comic book, as in the comic book came before anything else, you could even throw in Transformers because the comic book premiered before the cartoon. Even alongside the toys. So you could argue the comic book existed. The comic book was on shelves the same day the toys were. So you could get the comic book before you got the toys. So you could make a case for Transformers being a comic book property. Even if you remove the Transformers, which you shouldn't, but even if you did, that doesn't really change the hard numbers that much. So you can't say that it's audience fatigue because there's too many sci-fi comic book superhero movies, because again, I can go back and show you the slasher genre got way more output, and it had a brief lull for about 4 or 5 years where there were still slashers being made, by the way. They just weren't having the big impact or the big output that they had until Scream came along. Now I have to go back to slashers because here's the nuance. Slashers are genre specific. General audiences, your regular mom and dad, your 8-year-old kids, your normal teenagers that are into like sports and TikTok don't give a fuck about slashers. They do not watch slashers. The people that watch slashers are horror fans, specifically slasher fans, and usually teenagers that are just going for the thrill. You don't get a lot of adults outside of that. You don't get hardly any kids at all because they're R-rated movies or not rated in the case of the Terrifier films. And you don't get a lot of they appeal to teenagers more, but there's a lot of teenagers that don't watch horror movies or slashers, so they don't have broad appeal. Now, your comic book and your sci-fi movies, believe it or not, have always had broader appeal. Even before you get into Star Wars and the big blockbuster boom of the 80s till today, your sci-fi movies, even though they were B movies, still did well. The Day the Earth Stood Still, The Thing from Another World, The Blob. These were still big hits for their time, all throughout. Same with horror. It's always had, like, its audience. Now, horror's been, like, here. Sci-fi's been, like, here. Today, it's like, horror is here, sci-fi is up here, but horror has elevated, sci-fi is elevated tremendously. So, what gives? Who's watching sci-fi movies? Who's watching comic book movies specifically? Well, they have a broader appeal because there's that element of hope. Horror movies don't have an element of hope. They're nihilistic. It's like, hey, you're gonna die. And if you're not gonna die, you're gonna be traumatized for life and probably institutionalized. So you're fucked either way. Sci-fi and superhero movies, yeah, you could die because the villain is out to kill people because they want to take over the world. So there's a good chance you might die. But if you're one of the heroes, if you're one of the main characters in the movie, your odds of survival are increased because you've got fantastical powers. Captain America, Iron Man, Superman, etc. And that gives people hope. Also, your horror movies don't really have happy endings. They usually have somebody who barely survived, but they're usually being hauled off by police, screaming hysterically as they're taken off to the insane asylum to be studied. Because they just experienced an extremely traumatic event. If you're lucky enough to survive a slasher movie, you're gonna die in the sequel. Those are just the odds. So you're still not safe even if you get through, night one of the villain's murder spree. A year later, he's coming back for your bitch. That doesn't usually happen in the comic book genre. It's rare for a main character to die. In a horror movie, you don't know who the main character is until they survive. Because they're all kind of treated equally. The main character in a horror movie is the villain, the killer, the entity. The little girl from The Ring. Or it's the haunted house in The Conjurings. Or it's a masked killer like Jason. Or Freddy Krueger. Or who's not really wearing a mask, but kind of, sort of. Or Michael Myers. Or Chucky. That's the main character. You're there to watch the killer do his business and get the kills. That doesn't really have mass market appeal. So, general audiences are more likely to go see a Star Wars or a Batman than they are to go see a Chucky. It's just the facts. Now, a big hit for a horror movie, if a horror movie, slasher or otherwise, makes $50 million, that's considered a hit. If it makes $100 million, which very, very few do, most of the ones that have are called Scream, or a Scream sequel, it's considered a mega hit. In sci-fi, and especially comic book movies, if it doesn't make at least $200 million or more, it's considered a flop. Because you can make a slasher movie on $100,000 to $3 or $4 million budget. That tends to be the range. You cannot make a sci-fi movie that people will watch, a comic book movie that people will watch, on less than $100 million. You could probably make one for about 50, 60 million, and you could probably get lucky. Like the Deadpools have had lower budgets, and some others have had lower budgets. But you're still getting 10 times to 15 times the budget starting out in a sci-fi or comic book movie than you are in a horror movie. It's very, very rare you get a $25 to $50 million budget for a horror movie. It does occasionally happen, and it does occasionally pay off, but it's rare. On the flip side, it's expected, if you're making a sci-fi or a comic book movie, it's expected that you're going to get at minimum 50 to 75 million. That's a low budget sci-fi blockbuster. That's a low budget. Hey, The Phantom Menace was made on about a $60 million budget. And that movie did gangbusters. The Empire Strikes Back was made on about a $60 million budget. That did gangbusters. So it can be done. The original Star Wars was made on about a $20 million budget. And holy shit, did it make its money back, and then some more, and then a whole lot more on top of it. So yeah. And that's where we get into the myth busting. Superhero and comic book movies, no, there's not really, shall we say, comic book fatigue. Here's the thing. You still have the genre fans, the sci-fi fans, the comic book fans. They're going to see everything, and they do. If you take The Flash as an example, to Hollywood, it was a flop because they spent damn near $300 million to make it, and it barely made that back. Well, they spent too much to make it. That's the problem. But here's the thing. If they had made that movie on a $100 million budget or a $75 million budget, it would have been still hella profitable. You got to look at the numbers. The number of people, and again, the number of people going to see sci-fi movies and comic book movies has declined a little bit in the last 4 or 5 years, but not by as much as you think. And part of it is because a couple of factors, especially the MCU, and even to a lesser extent the DCEU and the Star Wars. Those tend to be interconnected genre films, right? You kind of have to see all of them to get the whole story. A lot of people have got fed up with that. They just want like standalone sci-fi movies or smaller franchises. They might still follow like an Iron Man or a Captain America or a Batman, but they don't necessarily want to follow an Avengers or a Justice League anymore because that's too much. They don't want to go see 5 movies a year to get the whole story. They just give me 1 or 2 good sci-fi blockbusters or superhero movies and I'm good. So we got too many all at once. That's kind of what happened. So it isn't, part of it is, audiences aren't going in the big numbers, but that's because it was new and exciting for a while, and that new and exciting, the shiny, has worn off. So now people are like, all right, you've given me that movie already, and you've given me 17 sequels that are just almost identical. I want something new and fresh. And new and fresh doesn't necessarily mean something that isn't a sci-fi comic book superhero movie. They just want something that's different than the standard fare. And we're not really getting that too much. And then you look at, like, the broader franchise fatigue, right? You've got remakes galore, right? Or legacy sequels. Beetlejuice, Top Gun Maverick, Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny, and all this shit. And they're having mixed receptions. Some are doing better than others, but in general, franchises are safer than original titles in general, but they're still getting kind of played out. Audiences are kind of getting fed up. They want something different. But Hollywood isn't giving us different. When you take something like Wicked, it's doing hella good, right? People are responding, but is that new? No, it's a new take on something that's old and established, but it's still The Wizard of Oz, or set in the Wizard of Oz universe. So it's still familiar. Now, general audiences, the mom and dad who were going to the comic book movies because their kids were invested in the franchise, and they were going along because they were still good movies, they've moved on to streaming. Now here's the thing. We're still getting sci-fi comic book superhero blockbusters on streaming sites. They're just coming in the form of a miniseries. And I'm going to call it a miniseries if it has less than 20 episodes. It is what it is. But you're getting a lot of Disney Plus miniseries. Star Wars, The Last of Us, things like that. Twisted Metal, some Halo, there's a few others. Those are still doing really well, right? So no, there's not comic book or superhero fatigue. There's not sci-fi fatigue. People are craving this stuff. They're desperate. They're hungry for it. They want more. They're just not going to the theaters to get it anymore. And that's the crux of it. It isn't that there's superhero fatigue. It's that audiences' viewing habits have changed. Now, for the longest time, you went to the arcade to get the latest video games because that's where they came out. And then you waited for a decidedly inferior home console port to come along later, and then the next generation down the road, you would get another port of the game that was more faithful and accurate to the arcade. Same kind of situation with home movies, right? You would watch the movie on a big screen with surround sound in the cinema in full-on 4K high definition, because that's what film resolution is equivalent to. And then you'd go home and watch a crappy version of it a few months later on VHS on a tiny little square CRT television that was interlaced and fuzzy and pixelated and blocky and had half the picture cut off. That was an inferior experience. And then DVD gave you a little bit better experience. You got widescreen, you got a de-interlaced, it still wasn't progressive scan, it was de-interlaced picture with the full frame, but it was still lower resolution on a smaller TV screen. Now, you may have had a good surround sound system. We'll come back to that in a minute. Or you just plugged it, or you just let it play in your TV speakers, or maybe you plugged it into your boombox that was sitting, or stereo deck sitting on the, on the shelf next to the TV. Then we got big screen, widescreen, progressive scan, flat screen, high definition TVs, and we got Blu-ray, 4K Blu-ray, and HD DVD, and then high definition streaming and television. All of a sudden, now you're getting an experience at home that is almost indistinguishable from the cinema, and in some cases, if you have a good setup, it can be a better experience because you're in the comfort of your own home. You got a nicer, more comfortable chair with elbow room, nobody behind you or in front of you, no whispering, nobody with their cell phone, no talking, no audience laughing. It's just you watching the movie. And that is, in general, a better experience. And because TVs are now big enough and resolution on Blu-ray and high-definition streaming is now high enough, and we're getting the proper frame, the aspect ratio, you don't really have much of an incentive to go to the cinema. Not to mention, yeah, you're going to pay about $30 a month or more to get the various streaming services. But you're still going to get a pretty good catalog of other things to watch. So you might have to wait a month or two for your favorite movie to come to the streaming service, but that's not much of a wait. So why go out, get in the car, get dressed, go find a parking spot, stand in line, buy a ticket, sit in a crowded theater where people are talking and munching and it's messy and noisy and you don't have elbow room. And there's people in front of you and behind you. The guy behind you is saying, hey, sit down. And you're saying the same thing to the guy in front of you. So yeah, it's not as good of an experience. Now, some people still prefer the social aspect, and this is where I'm getting at. teenagers are always going to be the ones that drive the cinema because they always have. Adults who used to say, you know what, let's take the family, let's go out, let's watch a movie, they can't afford it anymore. And you can get a better or comparable experience at home. You know, instead of having to wrangle the kids, get them dressed, get them showered, get them, find a parking spot, tell them to behave, smack them on the bottom when they don't. If you do that kind of thing, not everybody does. I don't, I wouldn't, but some people do. Whatever you got to do to get them to behave, and then you still got to sit in the theater, and then you got to take the kid to the bathroom midway through the movie, miss the most important scene because the kid had to go potty, come back, and you're like lost, you don't know what the fuck happened, and where's the guy? Oh, they died? What the hell? And you missed it. If you're at home and the kid's like, Mommy, Daddy, I gotta go potty, you just pause the movie, the kid goes and does its business and comes back. So yeah, the families that used to go to the cinema in droves are staying home because it's cheaper. A family of 4 or 5 trying to go out to the movies, that's $100 to take a family of 5 to the cinema. Or you could just sit at home and get the cinema experience for your $20 a month that you pay for whatever streaming service you pay for. Or maybe you rent it on Amazon. You rent a movie once a month on Amazon. That's still like $25, 10 to $25, depending on the movie and when it came out, to rent it for a family of 5 versus damn near $100 or more to go to the cinema. So it isn't audience fatigue. It isn't superhero fatigue that's making it harder for superhero movies in the cinema to make money. It's audiences are just choosing to stay home. Now, teenagers are still going to drive the cinema because they always have, they always will. But teenagers are starting to get to the point where they'll just watch it on their phone, on the bus or at recess or during study hall. They don't have to go to the cinema as much as they used to. And teenagers today, and as we get further entrenched into technology, are more accustomed to socializing with their friends online. They're not necessarily gathering in a group to go to the cinema for the social aspect, because that's a social experience they're not comfortable with. They'd rather sit at home and watch it with their friends. They're in their bedroom watching it on their laptop. Their friends in their bedroom watching it on their laptop, and they're sharing their screen over Discord or something similar. So you don't really have the audiences going to the cinema as much. And that's the thing. You still have to spend the $100 million to make a superhero movie. You're just not going to get your return at the cinema. So you have to adjust your expectations. You have to budget accordingly. You have to say, okay, we're going to make this much at the cinema. It's not going to make our money back. We have to accept that. So now we got to make our money off of Blu-ray and DVD sales, merchandise, and streaming. Hollywood hasn't quite figured out how to do that yet. They're trying. Disney's the best at it. They're the ones that have figured out, hey, we know people are going to go see a new Star Wars, but we know they're not going to go to the cinema to see it, so we're going to put it on Disney Plus and people will watch it. That'll keep them paying monthly for Disney Plus. Even if you only go to the cinema twice a year, any random streaming service is still cheaper in the long run, value-wise, than going to the cinema twice a year. Now, I only go once a year. I've only been to the cinema once this year, and that was to see Terrifier 3. I can't afford it. And it cost me $30 to go see Terrifier 3. Now, yeah, I'm going to sit for I'm going to sit in the theater for 2 hours. I got to have a big bucket of popcorn and a Coke to get through it. But yeah, it's expensive to go to the cinema. And that's the thing. I could have waited for Terrifier 3 to come out on streaming, because it did quickly. But nah, that movie got great reviews, and it was the whole social thing. I wanted to experience it in the cinema because other horror fans were experiencing it. and having a blast. And I saw it opening weekend because that's when I was like rooting for it to be a success. I wanted that movie to break records, and it did. And I wanted to be a part of that so I can say, hell yeah, I helped make Terrifier 3 the massive success it is. Highest grossing unrated movie of all time. Highest grossing unrated horror movie. It broke records, and I wanted to be a part of that. But I don't need to go sit in a cinema to watch a new fucking Batman movie. I'll sit at home and watch it on my laptop, or maybe plug it into my 32-inch flat screen TV. But I don't need to go find a parking spot, stand in line, pay $30 for popcorn and everything else to sit in a crowded theater and listen to the asshole behind me tell me to sit down while I'm yelling at the asshole in front of me to sit the fuck down. I don't need that. I'll just stay home like every fucking buddy else. Stay cool.